It's already in the title, right? Les fleurs du mal, the flowers of evil. That which is beautiful about what we usually consider evil. There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. But I can't remember reading a book that so overtly screamed at me to change my life. With care, transmuting furious thoughts to gently breathing air. Hello everyone, hi! Let's talk about how to get into French literature today. These are all my French books, and I have chosen a total of 9 books that I think would be a fantastic place to start if French literature is intriguing you. There's gonna be some novels, poetry, theater plays, and philosophy in this video. And those are the books that I would recommend to a friend if we were going for coffee and they told me they're interested in French literature. They like the classics, but they don't know where to start. With every book, I'll also read you a little quote so you can get a feeling for the writing style of the author. Let's get right into it. A few words on reading French literature. I feel like French literature can be a little bit daunting to get into because there are those really big classics that one immediately thinks about. In Search of Lost Time by Marcel Proust or The Hunchback of Notre Dame by Victor Hugo. And often when one gets into those difficult, long, dense books immediately, it can actually end up being a very discouraging experience. You might find out a few pages into the book that you have none of the historical background that you need, that it's way too dense, and then you kind of feel a little bit ashamed of yourself. You just close the book, you put it back on the shelf, and you never tell anyone about it. And you're afraid of reading classic literature. I say that because I have been there, right? I've made that mistake many times, and I want that video to basically prevent that from happening for you. Because I love French literature. I love the language, I love the social justice and the beauty I keep finding in French novels. I love the aesthetic, the philosophy, and the attention to detail. And I've spent the past year almost exclusively reading French classics because I study literature and French is one of my chosen foreign languages. And I had the opportunity to study a semester abroad in Paris, actually, at the University of Sorbonne Nouvelle. So obviously I wanted to be well prepared and I had a lot of reading assignments there and everything. And on top of all of that, I've also created a course myself about the history of French literature. It's called French Literature, A Reader's Journey Through the Classics, which, you know, if you're into this topic, I can recommend it. I'll link it below. It's basically the 8-hour version of this video. So if you want to get into the French classics deeply, then I hope you'll check it out. A couple more housekeeping items before I get into the first book. I'll make a different video about how to read in French, tips that have helped me to get through French books, and some examples of small books that I started with that I really liked. That will be a separate video. I initially wanted to do that all in one go, but I realized that it's gonna be way too long. So you can keep an eye out for that. And lastly, if you're benefiting from these videos, please consider supporting the channel financially. I always link my Ko-fi account in the description box below. And now there's also an option of clicking the thanks button on YouTube and you can make a little donation. And if you have supported the channel in the past, I truly appreciate you so much for doing that. You're the reason why I still sit here every week and do what I do. Okay, those are the 9 books. Let's start with novels. I understand that I'm probably not the first person to recommend Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert to you, but I couldn't, in good conscience, keep myself from recommending this truly great masterpiece of French literature. A story about a woman, Emma Bovary, who's not satisfied with anything in life. Not with where she lives, not with her marriage. She just always wants more. She reads a lot, and through that she gets a lot of ideas of how she would ideally like to live. and real life just cannot keep up with her expectations, so she keeps getting disappointed. So relevant in our progressively more materialistic, superficial, and dopamine-driven age. Flaubert's writing style is realism. He famously said, "L'auteur dans son œuvre doit être comme Dieu dans l'univers, présent partout et visible nulle part," meaning the author in his work should be like God in the universe, present everywhere but visible nowhere. And that's what you get with Flaubert. You sense when you're reading him that he doesn't pick sides. There's no conclusion or moral message overtly present in the text, which makes this book the perfect Rorschach test. Every person reading this novel will take something different away from it, and it is for that reason that I cannot wait to reread this novel over my lifetime and see how my insights change. And the most intriguing thing about this book for me is that, as I said, it's not moralizing at all, but I can't remember reading a book that so overtly screamed at me to change my life. I feel like, in a way, this book saved me. Like, I read it in a very tough time in my life, and emotionally it saved me. It changed something inside of me, and I would love for other people to have that experience too. Here's what the preface to this edition says. This is translated by Geoffrey Wall, by the way, which is a great translation in my opinion. Closing the novel, you might be crying your eyes out, as Flaubert himself was when he wrote the final tragic scenes. Later on, you might start to wonder. You go back and reread. Like an aggressive child pulling a dead fly apart, you ask, "What's this made of?" We cannot, of course, respond exactly as Flaubert's contemporaries did to his masterpiece. Great upheavals in our intellectual, political, and sexual lives have subsequently intervened. We read differently. Yet this novel is a classic precisely because it goes on inventing generation after generation of readers into a passionate conversation about the dilemmas and conflicts it depicts. Madame Bovary is utterly modern. It's the first sex and shopping novel, after all. Emma Bovary, desperately seeking satisfaction and fulfillment, employs retail therapy as an escape from an unhappy marriage, experiments with adultery, is obsessed with money and with material objects as substitutes for happiness. She's convinced it's men who've got it all. Power and freedom and choice and ease of movement. She can't buy herself the male privileges she envies, so she spends money on blue glass vases and new curtains instead. Here's a quote from the book, page 114. The next day, for Emma, was one of mourning. Everything seemed to be wrapped in a confusion of shadows, drifting over their surfaces, and sorrow plunged into her soul with a muffled howling, like the sound of the winter wind in some abandoned chateau. It was the kind of reverie that comes when something vanishes forever. The lassitude we feel when some habitual movement is interrupted, when any prolonged vibration comes to a sudden stop. Also, if I would want to become a writer, I would study this book deeply. I mean, the pacing is just chef's kiss, honestly. So good. I couldn't believe how little effort was required for me to get through this book. Flaubert also wrote some short stories. Where are they? This is an Oxford World Classics edition of 3 of his short stories. Most famous is probably Un cœur simple, a simple heart. Here it is in French, but I kind of wouldn't recommend you start with them. They just don't pack the same punch as Madame Bovary, and I think Flaubert just doesn't shine as much in the short stories. So even though Madame Bovary is a lot longer, you don't have to be afraid of it. It's very straightforward. You don't have to know much about the context of the time or anything. It's a timeless story and it is written in that way. Moving on to the next novel. This is And There Was Light by Jacques Lucérin. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I only have the German edition, Das wiedergefundene Licht. Jacques Lucérin turned blind This is an unbelievable autobiography. Jacques Lucérin turned blind through an accident when he was 7 or 8 years old. And then when he was a teenager, the Nazis occupied France and he became the leader of an underground resistance group. And it's just crazy how he describes those scenes in the book. Like, he's the head, the leader of that underground resistance group, but he's blind, right? So he talks about how he recruits people and how he determines whether he can trust them. He doesn't have his eyesight to determine whether someone is fit and trustworthy. He relies on the sound of their voice, for example. And the entire book, I feel, is about how his senses and his feeling is just heightened despite the fact that he is blind, or maybe because of it. The underground resistance group kept intact for quite a while. Eventually, though, he got arrested and sent to the concentration camp in Buchenwald. They crammed 2,000 resistance fighters into one of these transporting trains. Like, they're not trains like you think of them today. They're like wagons in which they transported animals, like just one big container basically, and they crammed 2,000 people in there. And he was one of the only 30 that survived even the journey. And again, the entire story is described from his point of view, and he cannot tell us what things look like. But the feeling of reading this book is so special because you have that sense of being blind as well, while at the same time you can see so much. And the author, and we by reading it, perceive a lot of light. Like, he always talks about light as kind of an inner source and being able to see light even though he's blind. I don't know, he describes it better. Anyways, it's an unbelievably courageous story and very well written, and the fact that it's real is just, you know, gut-wrenching. I get goosebumps every time I talk about it, and I read a review of someone saying this book is one of the most touching and heart-wrenching I have ever read. And it is also one of the most inspiring and uplifting books I have ever read. And I completely agree with that statement. It's giving Viktor Frankl. And yeah, so tough, but such an important book. As I said, I unfortunately don't have the English copy, so I can't read you a quote, but I found one on the internet. My parents were protection, confidence, warmth. When I think of my childhood, I still feel the sense of warmth above me, behind and around me. That marvelous sense of living not yet on one's own, but leaning body and soul on others who accept the charge. My parents carried me along, and that, I'm sure, is the reason why through all my childhood I never touched ground. I could go away and come back. Objects had no weight, and I never became entangled in the web of things. I passed between dangers and fears as light passes through a mirror. That was the joy of my childhood, the magic armor which, once put on, protects for a lifetime. So beautiful. I also gave this as a present to, I think, 4 people in my life, and they all loved it as well. So, okay, moving up the timeline a little bit to a more contemporary French writer, I have really come around to enjoying Annie Ernaux. She's the most recent and so far only female French recipient of the Nobel Prize for Literature. And she writes autofiction, blending autobiography and fiction. A little bit Proustian, she takes little incidents from her life and those really fragile feelings and impressions she describes so authentically, and it just makes the reader connect with her. I think she's really good at that. I think she has something uniquely new to bring to the table, and I wanna read you what the committee awarded her the Nobel Prize for in 2022, because I feel like it sums up her writing very well. So she got the prize for, quote, the courage and clinical acuity with which she uncovers the roots, estrangements, and collective restraints of personal memory. She has many great books, and I don't really specifically recommend one of them over all the others. This is L'autre fille, the other girl, I think it is in English. It describes the experience of what it's like to have a dead sibling, like someone who has died before you were even born, and just feeling like a replacement for that person. Very touching, very eerie in a way. Then I also, for example, have A Man's Place. This is in German, Der Platz, talking about her father's life. And then Simple Passion is about an affair with a married man. A lot of them are very short, and not a lot is lost picking one of them up and seeing whether her writing style resonates with you. I would just look through the blurbs and pick one that speaks to you the most. She's really good at working through personal trauma in a collective way. Here's a little quote from Simple Passion before we move on. Sometimes I wonder if the purpose of my writing is to find out whether other people have done or felt the same things, or if not, for them to consider experiencing such things as normal. Maybe I would also like them to live out these very emotions in turn, forgetting that they had once read about them somewhere. And then lastly, for novels, Victor Hugo. I know there's going to be some people who say you can't talk about French literature without talking about Victor Hugo, and I agree with that sentiment. I just don't feel entirely ready to really give recommendations on his work. I simply haven't read enough of him yet. But a friend, and I would consider her a colleague, Emily, from the YouTube channel Prose and Petticoats, she has made an entire video titled How to Get into Victor Hugo or something like that, where to start. So I'm just gonna refer you to that video because she knows a lot better than I do. All I can say is The Last Day of a Condemned Man is very short, very easy to read, and it's basically Victor Hugo taking a stance against the death penalty. So maybe it's great to start with. I just somehow don't feel like it shows you what Victor Hugo can really do. For that, Notre Dame de Paris or The Hunchback of Notre Dame is probably a much better bet, but I would not recommend just jumping into that without any preparation the way I did. It was an extremely tough, rewarding, but very, very tough read for me. Hugo knows so much about history, art, literature, architecture, and what he puts into his works is just breathtaking. Honestly, I'm still too dumbfounded to talk about it. So watch Emmelies' video. Moving on to essays, we all know what's coming. My favorite French essays are, let's say it all together, the complete essays by Michel de Montaigne. Montaigne, with his 107 essays that are all compiled together in this Penguin edition, is known as the father of the personal essay. He literally invented the genre, probably without knowing it. For sure, without knowing it. They become progressively longer as you keep reading them. The first ones are just a few pages, and then the last ones are sometimes 50, 60 pages long. Because they're chronological, right? So as he becomes older, his thoughts become more refined, and that's a really great experience to go through these essays chronologically and to kind of age with them. Essayer in French means to try something, and in Montaigne's essays it comes through so well that essays are meant to be a medium where one can try out thoughts without necessarily having them in the perfect shape or having a solution or having it all figured out or anything. I know I've said that before, but he is a guiding light for me in that way. Let me read you an example from the essay To Philosophize is to Learn How to Die. Cicero says that philosophizing is nothing other than getting ready to die. That is because study and contemplation draw our souls somewhat outside ourselves, keeping them occupied away from the body, a state which both resembles death and which forms a kind of apprenticeship for it. Or perhaps it is because all the wisdom and argument in the world eventually come down to one conclusion, which is to teach us not to be afraid of dying. Here's another quote from the essay on 3 kinds of social intercourse, one of my favorite ones. I live from day to day, and saving your reverence, I live only for myself. My plans stop there. In youth I studied in order to show off. Later, a little to make myself wiser. Now I do it for amusement, never for profit. So all in all, an essay collection that is accessible, important, beautiful, all the adjectives. Okay, let's talk about Proust next. If you've spent any amount of time on this channel, you most probably know that In Search of Lost Time is my favorite book ever. And in that way, I would of course recommend it. But I also understand that it's very difficult to wrangle with Proust's long sentences, his detailed descriptions, and his stream of consciousness writing in general. Right, it's the thing that makes him great is also what makes him so difficult to read. It can be very disorienting to read In Search of Lost Time. And it is for that reason that I have something else to recommend to you. So if you feel daunted by Proust and you just want to ease your way into it, here's a small collection of essays called Days of Reading. Very, very slim. In it, Proust explores what reading and writing meant to him. He talks about his childhood memories of when he started reading. He talks about what it means to be a writer and how to write realism. And it's just very accessible. If you get this same edition, I would say skip the first essay and go straight to Days of Reading. Here's the first sentence from that essay. There are no days of my childhood which I lived so fully, perhaps as those I thought I had left behind without living them. Those I spent with a favorite book. I think in my Proust video for the French literature course, I said something like, if you like these essays, you'll like In Search of Lost Time. And if you don't like them, I don't think you'll like In Search of Lost Time. And I still stand by that. Moving on to theater, we of course have to talk about Molière. Molière is the stage name for Jean-Baptiste Poquelin, who was famously the most important playwright in French history. His slapstick humor really always aimed to hold a mirror up to life, and he made fun of the very people that he was playing for, which got him into some sticky situations in his life, to say the least. I'm a bit torn on which play I would recommend you read or watch by Molière, so I'll say this. Just read or watch one of them. For the course I made, I ended up choosing The Misanthrope because the poetry and the rhythm of the French language is just unmatched in there, in my opinion. In essence, this play is about Alceste, our main character, who is really fed up with the hypocrisy of the people in his life and the hypocrisy of humankind in general. Here's a quote by Alceste. To honor all men is to honor none. Since you embrace this indiscriminate vice, your friendship comes at far too cheap a price. I spurn the easy tribute of a heart which will not set the worthy man apart. I choose, sir, to be chosen, and in fine, the friend of mankind is no friend of mine. Okay, same quote in French. Et ce n'estimez rien qu'estimer tout le monde, puisque vous y donnez dans ces vices du temps. Morbleu, vous n'êtes pas pour être des méchants. Je refuse d'un cœur la vaste complaisance, qui ne fait de mérite aucune différence. Je veux qu'on me distingue, et pour le trancher net, l'ami du genre humain n'est point du tout mon fait. Oh my gosh. But even though I love The Misanthrope, it's a little bit of an unusual play for Molière. It is about hypocrisy, that's a thread you'll find in all of Molière's plays, but it's not exactly representative of how Molière writes most of the time. Most plays are a lot more fast-paced and have that slapstick humor that I already mentioned. If you want a more traditional play, quote-unquote, maybe check out Le Malade Imaginaire. It's personally one of my favorite plays. The Hypochondriac in English. I also know that Benjamin from the Hardcore Literature Book Club has a fantastic podcast episode about Tartuffe. I'll link it below. It's very much worth checking out as well. In general, we're lucky that there are a lot of plays by Molière available to be watched on YouTube. So just, pick one of them. Oh, one important note though, the most important. If you do decide to read Molière in English, please get the Richard Wilbur translation. It's truly outstanding, and I'm kicking myself a little bit because I ordered the wrong translation. This is the Penguin Classics, not even comparable to the Richard Wilbur. They somehow translated it into prose. It's really not good. I'm sorry. You'll have a much better experience with Richard Wilbur. Okay, for poetry, I would unsurprisingly recommend you read The Flowers of Evil by Charles Baudelaire. I was strangely intimidated by this work for a long time. I was somehow sure that I wouldn't get it, but then I got this great bilingual edition. This is the Oxford World Classics, translated by James McGowan, and I binged through it somehow within a couple of days. And that never happens to me, especially not with poetry. Usually when I read poetry, I read a poem or two, and then I need to put the book away and think about it for a week before I feel like I can handle another one. Not so with this one. I mean, listen to this, so beautiful. From the poem Landscape or Paysage. Since I am plunged in this voluptuous delight of conjuring the spring with all the poet's might, of hauling forth a sun out of my heart with care, transmuting furious thoughts to gently breathing air. And the same in French. Car je serai plongée dans cette volupté, d'évoquer le printemps avec ma volonté, de tirer un soleil de mon cœur et de faire de mes pensées brûlantes une tiède atmosphère. Baudelaire is considered to be the first modern poet, rejecting both nature and progress. So he doesn't flee into idealism, but wanted to deal with reality as it is. Real beauty for him is not timeless. It is contemporary. It can be seen all around. And all the things that were previously marginalized in literature and poetry, like prostitutes, drinking, drugs, or homeless people, he recognizes them, and those people and topics are worthy of poetry. It's already in the title, right? Les fleurs du mal, the flowers of evil, that which is beautiful about what we usually consider evil. It was really the understanding of that tension that carried me through this collection of poems. He really did transmute mud into gold. And if you know anything about Baudelaire, you probably know that this collection of poetry stirred a lot of controversy at the time. The 6 forbidden poems were forbidden in France until 1949. Yeah, but in conclusion, the influence he had on other writers and how truly revolutionary his writing was, I think, is what makes it really worth it to read this collection of poetry, especially if you're into world literature. Like, he just comes back everywhere. Just the other day I was at university and I had a course about the history of German literature, and we talked about Baudelaire and his influence on symbolism. So yeah, he's everywhere. Switching gears a little bit, I think if you want to get into French philosophy, especially philosophy from the Enlightenment age, Jean-Jacques Rousseau is a wonderful place to start. I've talked about him on the channel before, but it's truly astounding to me how he wrote not only the first autobiography, he also founded modern pedagogy, and he was also one of the founders of social contract theory as we know it today. So if you want to read his autobiography, The Confessions, go right ahead. It's not the book I'm recommending to you today, but he had a very strange life, and it's somehow beautiful to see the first man embarking on a journey of writing about his life in such an authentic and almost overly emotional way. I mean, listen to this. This is from the first lines of The Confessions. If not better, I at least claim originality, and whether nature did wisely in breaking the mold with which she formed me can only be determined after having read this work. Whenever the last trumpet shall sound, I will present myself before the sovereign judge with this book in my hand, and loudly proclaim, thus have I acted, These were my thoughts. Such was I. I think if you ever want to write your own autobiography, or you're particularly interested in that genre, the Confessions should definitely be on your radar. But as a piece of philosophy, I think you should read A Discourse on Inequality. In it, Rousseau talks about where he thinks inequality originally came from. And here's a sentence from the book that sums up his stance quite well. Page 131. If we follow the progress of inequality in these different revolutions, we shall find that the establishment of law and the right of property was the first stage, the institution of magistrates, the second, and the transformation of legitimate into arbitrary power, the third and last stage. Now, I'm not someone who reads a lot of philosophy, so I can vouch that this is very easy to read. He even makes a point of saying that this is meant for the masses, so he doesn't want to use any technical terms or anything. And it just strikes me as one of those pivotal pieces of philosophy that everyone should know about. I'm going there. Everyone should know about this. Inequality is such a complicated issue, and this to me just seems like a very foundational text that if you have ever thought about inequality deeply, I think this will really enrich your thinking around that topic. For a more contemporary take on inequality, maybe check out Bourdieu, a French sociologist that is also very much worth reading. Oh, and this is a great translation, by the way. Maurice Cranston. Next to Enlightenment, I feel like existentialism is very interesting to people when it comes to French literature. The existentialist movement was spearheaded by Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre. They famously said that existence precedes essence when it comes to human life, and that we're essentially lost if we don't become aware of the meaninglessness in life. So I'm not gonna recommend The Stranger to you by Albert Camus, because it's actually a really difficult book to grasp philosophically. I'd suggest, as preparation for The Stranger, you first dip your toes into The Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus. This is translated by Justin O'Brien, and don't be fooled by how little this book is. It's packed full of deep ideas to ponder, and it might be one of those where you can really only read a small handful of pages at a time, and then you have to let it sink in. That's what it was like for me. Here's a sentence from the first page. There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. All the rest, whether or not the world has 3 dimensions, whether the mind has 9 or 12 categories, comes afterwards. What I like about this book is that it's written in a way that is easy to understand. The ideas are very complex, but the language is not. And Camus' work is built in stages. You know, there are like 3 steps, and you have to step on the first one in order to understand the next one. And that first stage is absurdism. And for that first stage, he has written The Myth of Sisyphus and The Stranger, because Camus wanted for every stage of his philosophy to write a piece of fiction, a piece of theater, and a piece of philosophy. So The Myth of Sisyphus and The Stranger, they're like complementing each other. They're on the same stage. So I would just recommend, before getting into The Stranger, to either get The Myth of Sisyphus and read a little bit in it, and or to get informed about existentialism. It's not as easy of a topic to grasp as it might seem in the beginning. And I'm just gonna shamelessly plug my course here again, because there's almost 2 hours of content on existentialism in my course. I've really broken the philosophy down into understandable bite-sized pieces. There's a lot of book recommendations in there, and I genuinely think it's a great resource if you want to learn about existentialism. So anyways, reading The Myth of Sisyphus will make you understand The Stranger better. I'm sure of that. You'll know what to look out for. It's definitely challenging though, right? It's not as easy to read as Rousseau. you'll definitely have a lot to chew on. To end this video, I just want to throw recommendations in here of books that are its own category in a way, because I either haven't read them in their entirety or they're only available in French. The first one is Stefan Zweig's Marie Antoinette. I know a lot of people know Stefan Zweig as a novelist, but he also wrote history in a very interesting way. And his book about Marie Antoinette, wife of Louis XVI, who was executed in the end by the guillotine, is apparently great. If you're interested in the French Revolution, I would recommend you check it out. My brother swears by Stefan Zweig's history books. He always says that he doesn't know anyone who's writing about history in a more engaging way. He told me that apparently when they had big feasts at Versailles, they would empty the fountains of water and they would fill them with wine. Like crazy stuff like that. Next, Alice au Pays du Langage by Mariana Jaguello, which would be translated to Alice in Language Land. The subtitle is Pour comprendre la linguistique, and it is unfortunately only available in French. But this is a great introduction to linguistics. I don't own a copy, unfortunately. I just skimmed it a bit at the university library in Paris. So if you study at the Sorbonne Nouvelle, there's like 5 or 6 copies of that book available. But it's so great. A book truly written for people who are curious about linguistics but don't know any of the terminology or any of the history. So, me, basically. Here's what the author said in the first chapter of the book. I'll read it to you in French, but she says that basically she wrote the book to be accessible to the most amount of people who aren't familiar with all kinds of university jargon, and that she put everything in there that one needs who feels a love and curiosity for language. Ce livre est donc une tentative pédagogique à l'usage du plus grand nombre. J'ai tenté de lui donner une forme aussi peu universitaire que possible, m'adressant à un public auquel je ne suppose aucune connaissance de la linguistique ni de son jargon. On y trouvera tout ce que, selon moi, on doit savoir quand on n'est pas linguiste et qu'on éprouve pour le langage amour et curiosité. Okay, wow, we made it through. I'll go ahead and link some of the videos that have to do with French literature and my time in Paris in the description box below in case you're curious to check out more of them. And again, if you want more from me besides just my YouTube videos, I created the course about French literature for me to be able to really take you by the hand and guide you step by step, book by book, author by author through the history of French literature. There's more than 8 hours of material in there, so just know that that resource exists. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll see you again soon. Bye bye.